let's welcome Pastor Mike.
Well, good morning. My daughter left yesterday morning to fly to Jamaica, and she is going to be there for 10 weeks on the mountain, doing vacation Bible school on steroids, basically. And she is looking forward to that, but also at the same time, the person that she's going to support is ill and is having to be brought back to the U.S. for treatment. So we're not quite sure how everything's going to go, so we'd appreciate your prayers for her this summer. As Terry said, I am Mike's brother-in-law, and I have known him for at least 27 years because my wife and I just celebrated our 26th wedding anniversary. And during part of that time, he was my pastor too. So I know a little bit of that relationship, and I know how genuine your pastor is and how good of a friend he is. And today, I will have to rat you out about taking the offering. That's probably why he sent me, is make sure the offering got took, okay? I'd like to ask you how you would treat a treasure. If I handed you a treasure today, how would you secure it? How would you contain it? How would you take care of it? If it was something that was beyond your worth, beyond what you were capable of paying back, how would you take care of that treasure? Most of us would probably head to the bank and find a safety deposit box, or at least find that fireproof safe within your own home, or just at least a fireproof file cabinet or something. You would have some urgency of containing the treasure. Today, I am saying that the treasure is contained in something no more fancy than this. I'd like for you to open your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and we'll read starting in verse 7. This clay pot is what contains the treasure today. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. The emphasis here is that we are the inexpensive container of the treasure. Now, the treasure can be of great worth, but the vessel is simply an earthen vessel. It's not about the size or the glamour of this particular jar of clay today. And we also realize that jars of clay come in all shapes and sizes. And just because this is cheap doesn't mean you can't put something more expensive inside of it. There are those that tell us that whenever we have faith in Christ, that everything is easy. Everything is glamorous. Everything, health, wealth, and prosperity is what we hear. And I guess they just kind of skipped over this passage, because this passage tells us that there's some hard times coming. It tells us about being pressed and perplexed and persecuted and struck down. Those don't sound like health, wealth, and prosperity to me. But it does tell us that there is something inside that is more glamorous and more treasured than the container itself. Let's skip over in this same chapter to verse 16 and pick up there. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. The fact that the vessel is so plain and ordinary does not take away from what is contained within. And our hope is not in this life. It's not in the container itself, but it is what it cannot be seen with the naked eye. Jesus Christ and our faith in Him cannot be seen, but we still strive forward with that treasure and that thing that is beyond all measure, beyond what we can see with our eyes today. Let's talk a little bit more about the jars. In the King James, that is translated as earthen vessels. And our clay pots, go ahead and advance. This clay pot is about $1, maybe a little bit more. You can buy it at Lowe's, and if you ask really nice, you can ask for the chipped one, and they'll give you half off. You probably don't want the chipped one, but you can see that there's a pretty good gouge out of this one. And I felt like this kind of illustrated the way life treats us sometime. And now let's move to the next slide, and this one's a little bit more expensive than this. You're not going to go be able to find this one at Lowe's. In fact, in trying to illustrate the expense of this, in order to find out how much that is, you have to send them your name and their number, and they send you a price sheet. So I didn't even get a price on that one. You can tell that one is going to cost a little bit more than this. And the next one is going to cost even a little bit more than that. $1.32 million for something that was made in 1948. There are probably some folks around that were made since 1948. And I don't know that if I had $1.32 million that would be on my bucket list of owning today. However, this is probably bigger than that. It's not about the size, it's about the expertise and everything that goes with that particular teapot today. There's something about just taking clay anywhere in the world, from Egypt to China to America to South America, and just using this basic earthen material, and to take something that is cheap and worthless and being able to make something out of it that will hold something else, whether that be oil or food. How many of you use stoneware at your house? And how many of you cook in that? Or you have very expensive plants that go into these various pots today. The treasure is within. There is something about the way that this is made up, and the way that this is fired, and the way that this comes together that becomes very important for the plant itself, because water can kind of breathe through the pores that are in the clay. And it keeps the plant from being oversaturated and being overwatered. There's something about if you took the clay itself and tried to contain the flour in the clay itself, that wouldn't work. But once it's fired and shaped, it becomes able to do that. You couldn't just take clay and be able to store your oil in there, but you can take the clay and make something shaped a little bit differently than this, but still look sort of like this and contain the oil. And you can find out how cheap or expensive the pot is just by tapping it and being able to hear the tone that comes back from that to know if it's solid or if it's chipped or broken. But it also thuds if it's a little bit cheaper, or it rings at a higher pitch if it's expensive and well made. So when we come together today, we realize that we are not the treasure, but there's something that is in common with all of the different jars of clay that we've displayed here. The jar of clay is defined more by the content than by the jar itself, because the jar itself is so fragile. This supreme treasure of salvation for both you and I are entrusted into something that is frail and fallible. This jar of clay is not that impressive whenever you look. But why would God entrust his treasure of salvation to such fragile vessels to begin with? It is simple. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. The responsibility of the jar is simply to contain the treasure and not to overshadow that treasure. Not to complain about the chip here and there or the scuff, but to say the treasure is inside. We can be amazed by how much humanity has accomplished, but we realize how fragile we are. If you don't have the right amount of water, life cannot be sustained. But if water is in the wrong place, if the water is in your lungs, you die. You can't even see the air that you breathe, but without that air, within a few moments, we die. Life is fragile. We know that from so many of our friends and family who have gone on to be with the Lord. We realize that we don't last forever. We're temporary. Then he talks to us about how here we are, we're fragile, and yet we have all of these bad things that are happening, hard-pressed, perplexed, persecuted, and struck down. And yet, you're here today. I'm here today. We're making it. We can be encouraged by that. We can pat each other on the back and say, hey, we're hanging in there. Hey, we're making it. Notice how this is increasingly worse. At first, there's this little bit of pressure, and then there is a little bit of confusion that goes along with that pressure. And then there's persecution. They're out to get you. And then there is the being struck down. It's an increasing amount of pressure that is being put on the life. Christianity is not about life getting easier. But then again, nothing worth anything gets easier as you do it, right? There's something that's more intense and more pressure as you try to accomplish anything in this life. So he says to us, we do not lose heart. We do not get discouraged. Inwardly, we may be wasting away, or we may be getting those cracks and chips. But he calls it our light and momentary troubles. And it's for us an eternal glory. We may be at the end of our rope, but that doesn't mean that we're at the end of hope. Let's look at that phrase of light and momentary troubles for just a moment. I recently heard a story about a man named Carl Pitteri. He went to work one day in March of 2011, drove his pickup truck through the gates of his plant. The buildings on the outside were painted like the sky, light blue background with puffy clouds. Went into that building that was about the size of an airplane hangar. And during the morning that day, an earthquake hit. And by the way, that particular building housed a nuclear generator, which was at 100% capacity, 100% power at that particular moment that the earthquake hit. This was in Fukushima, Japan. So you may know the rest of the story. Carl made it outside of the building after horrific things going on the inside of that building. Got outside just in time to see 3 different tsunamis hit. Emptied the harbor right out in front of him, and he saw a freighter being crushed on the bay of that harbor. And before it was all over, that sunny day turned into a snowstorm. So how many of you have experienced an earthquake, a nuclear disaster, a tsunami, and a snowstorm all on the same day? Whenever we hear something like that, we realize how truly blessed we are. And we realize that the things that we experience in our life really are light and momentary troubles. Paul goes on to say later in this very chapter a little bit about his resume, about some of the things that he went through in his life, some of the things that he called light and momentary troubles. In chapter 11, verses 24 through 26, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes, minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, and in danger from Gentiles, and danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face the daily pressure of my concerns for all of the churches. Okay, so we all say, after that, my week wasn't quite so bad as I thought. There's a variation of a quote that I heard a long time ago. Everywhere that Paul went, they beat him up, and everywhere that I go, they offer me a cup of coffee. So maybe our challenges about Christianity aren't as tough as we think that they are. Of the different things that you see on that list, what do you think is the worst? The fact that he was beaten with 39 lashes? That Jewish punishment was this consideration that 40 lashes would kill a man, so therefore we're only going to hit him 39 times. Now, out of all of the people that they gave that punishment to, do you think anyone ever died on the 39th? Someone had to have gotten beaten and died on the 39th, but the fact of the matter is, he had that done to him 5 different times. The Roman punishment was to be hit with a rod. Now, I don't know about you, but if anyone's coming and they're going to hit me with either a whip or a rod, I'm going to tell them where Grandma hides the jar of money out in the backyard. I'm not putting up with that. I don't know about you. I don't know how tough you are. And I had this image of Paul being this weak man because he says later in chapter 12 about his thorn in the flesh. So how many of you have been able to endure the 39 lashes 5 different times, or being beaten with a rod 3 different times? Now, what about stoning? This is the audience participation part, okay? I walked in today and I asked for a rock, and about 15 guys went scattering. The image of stoning that you have in the Bible is probably sort of like my image of stoning. We've seen it in movies, we've seen it in television shows, right, where they grab a rock, maybe about the size of a baseball, and they throw it overhand at the guy, and that's the image that we have of stoning. Is that correct? Is that what you've seen? Is that what you think stoning was in the Bible? The reality is that Stoning in the Bible was probably more of a rock about this size. And what they would do is create a pit. And that person was put in a pit, a deeper pit than from the stage to the floor here. And then a rock probably more like this, or even larger, was taken and dropped. That's stoning. I think I would take someone throwing the baseball size one at me rather than that, right? And he endured that for the gospel. So, how hard was your week? How much do we have to complain about today? And yet, on his list of things that he talks about today, what do you think is worse? And he says at the very beginning, at the very end of that particular passage, I face the daily pressure of my concern for all the churches. I've been where you are today. I've been in the pew. I've been in the pulpit. And there's something a little different. Whenever I work, I am occupied at my job for at least 40 hours a week, right? My mind is occupied by the pressure of that job. My mind is occupied by my responsibilities, the task, go to the next thing, make sure that that's taken care of. And that's where my mind is for that 40 hours. Then I come home and I can talk to my family, can talk to my friends, can take care of things about church, or take care of my hobbies, or take care of lawn work, yard work, housework, whatever the case may be. Whenever I was a pastor, my 40-hour job revolved at the church. I went home to my family who also attended church with me. My friends were people in the church. The music I listened to was usually music about church, because it would be music that we might be considering playing in church. That's more of the pressure of the pastor. That whenever we are thinking about church, it's part of the extra, and he is in it all the time. My intention today is simply encouragement. I'm not scolding anyone. I'm not on anyone. In fact, I didn't even tell Pastor Mike that this is how I was concluding this. I talked in general about the message. But I just want to remind you that even the pastor is made of a jar of clay and has the same pressures, the same strife that all of us have. And what we don't want to happen to any pastor, even though we know it has to some pastors, we don't want the jar of clay to break. So whenever you consider your pressure or your life, also think about praying for your pastor, because he does have a tremendous love for his church, a tremendous concern for his church, but it does bring with it some pressure. So think about him and pray for him often, which I know that you do. And I know that you appreciate the pastor that you have. And I know that you know that it's a full-time job and a lifestyle as well. It's more than just a hobby. It's more than just a passing fancy, but it's his passion. And I know because he was my pastor too. I can't say enough about my brother-in-law Mike and his wife Janice and their family. But I also know how proud he is of his church, because he speaks of you guys often. And he's very proud to be here, and he's proud to serve you. We have so much in common that we are all fragile. Yet we contain a treasure that is worth more than life itself. So when you're pushed upon this week, don't give up. Don't ever think about giving up. Just push through it, because we're basically all in the same boat. We basically have all of life pushing on us, and if it were not for the treasure within, it probably wouldn't be worth it. But the treasure within is so much more valuable than our life itself. Thank you for your attention. Let's stand together, pray for each other, and pray for Pastor today.